Yes, but he said quite a bit more tonight. It was really fascinating to see him. I think we should first note that Prime Minister Netanyahu hasn't exposed himself in this way to the press in several years. So it was very interesting to observe. But this appears to be a press conference organized at the last minute with an audience of one. This was the English part of this press conference was directed, I would say, like an arrow at Donald Trump himself. And we had a peek at some of, I think we had a behind the scenes peek at some of the discussions that these two leaders must have had over the last few months, and at the manner in which Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu framed this Iran situation for Donald Trump. So that was fascinating to see. The other thing that was very interesting was to see Prime Minister Netanyahu a little bit as a man on a tightrope, very exposed. He has built his entire career, more than 30 years in public service, on the Iran issue. And he is not asked, even tonight, I have to say, he was not asked, how can it be, with all of his years in power, that Iran every year has become a greater threat to Israel by his own, on his own terms, as he describes it, despite what he says are decades of effort. And what we know is almost a career-long fixation of Prime Minister Netanyahu on Iran. So it was very interesting to see him today, on the one side, kind of bat away the accusations that Israel drew President Trump into this. On the other hand, bat away the opposite questions, which is that only the United States is really leading this war and that Israel will do whatever Donald Trump tells it to do. It was interesting to hear him quote Churchill, his hero, who he loves to compare himself to, and other American figures. You could really hear a man trying to defend his entire worldview, a fairly dark worldview, possibly justified in some respects, but with a very unclear, in the real world now, this worldview is leading Israel to a very unclear outcome in terms of its own security, even in terms of its alliance with the United States. It is evident that Prime Minister Netanyahu is concerned about the opposition in the United States to this war. He was very careful when he talked about um, President Trump's followers backing this war. He's referring to, I think, the CNN poll that came out earlier today showing that MAGA, people who self identify as MAGA, support this war. But if you look at statistics of the United States, including people who identify as conservative, there is widespread opposition. There's also widespread skepticism in Congress. And Prime Minister Netanyahu clearly was trying to rise to the balustrades and explain his vision and why this is an all-important battle, a sort of high noon. He went into some disquisitions about what leadership is, really justifying and almost, I would say, denigrating every other Western leader other than Donald Trump. Um, Not to mention, of course, the Iranian leadership, who he couldn't stop referring to as lunatics, barbarians, and other epithets.